It was a quiet Sunday afternoon, the sunlight streaming in through the living room windows, creating patterns of warmth and shadow on the floor. David and I sat on the couch, cuddled up, watching a movie on our favorite streaming platform. The movie was engaging, but I couldn't shake feeling that something was amiss. I had always tried to maintain a good relationship with my mother-in-law, Margaret. She was a pleasant woman, at least on the surface, and I had no reason to suspect any wrongdoing. But the thought of our disappearing savings had begun to gnaw at me. I leaned against David, my mind racing. I knew I had to talk to him about it, but I didn't want to ruin our peaceful afternoon together. So I decided to wait until the movie ended and we could discuss it privately. As the credits rolled, I turned to David, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hey, David," I began tentatively. "I've been noticing something strange with our bank account lately." David glanced at me, his expression curious, but not yet alarmed. "What do you mean?" he asked. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to broach the subject delicately. "Well, I've been keeping track of our finances, and it seems like some money is disappearing from our savings account." David furrowed his brows, his concern growing. "What do you mean, disappearing?" I explained the discrepancies I'd found, the unexplained withdrawals that didn't seem to have any logical explanation. At first, he brushed it off as a potential banking error or an oversight, but I could see the doubt beginning to creep into his eyes. In the days following that initial conversation with David, my concerns about our finances continued to grow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It wasn't just the occasional missing funds. It was the unsettling pattern that emerged as I dug deeper into our financial records. I spent countless nights poring over bank statements, credit card bills, and transaction records. It became an obsession. Every discrepancy, every missing dollar fueled my determination to uncover the truth. I became a financial detective, meticulously tracking every financial transaction. The irregularities I discovered were small at first, just a few dollars here and there, which seemed insignificant on their own. But as I looked back over several months, the missing sums began to accumulate into a substantial amount. It was undeniable. Our savings were being siphoned away. Each withdrawal seemed calculated to avoid suspicion, timed carefully to coincide with my mother-in-law's visits. I couldn't help but wonder if Margaret was somehow involved. She had always seemed polite and pleasant on the surface, but the evidence was starting to point in a disturbing direction. As I stared at the records late one night, my mind raced with questions. How could I be sure it was Margaret? What would drive her to steal from her own son and me? Did David know about this, or was he as clueless as I had initially been? As my investigation into the missing funds continued, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The evidence pointed increasingly toward my mother-in-law, Margaret, but I needed concrete proof before making any accusations. To gather that evidence, I had to be patient and strategic. I began by meticulously documenting each withdrawal, cross-referencing dates and amounts with Margaret's visits to our home. It was a painstaking process, but it was the only way to establish a pattern that could not be dismissed as mere coincidence. The more I scrutinized the records, the more I noticed an eerie correlation. Every time Margaret came to visit, there would be a corresponding withdrawal from our savings account within a few days. It was as if she was intentionally timing her thefts to go unnoticed amid the chaos of her visits. I also started to notice that the withdrawals occurred on days when David and I were at work, making it unlikely that one of us was responsible. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and I couldn't ignore the mounting evidence any longer. One evening, after another dinner with Margaret, I couldn't keep my suspicions to myself any longer. I had grown increasingly tense during her visits, watching her every move, wondering if she was hiding something. As we sat in the living room, I took a deep breath and decided it was time to confront her. "Margaret," I began cautiously, "there's something I need to talk to you about." She looked at me, her expression unchanged, but there was a hint of curiosity in her eyes. "What is it, dear?" she asked innocently. I hesitated for a moment, choosing my words carefully. "I've been noticing some irregularities in our bank statements, particularly when you visit," I said. Margaret's face remained composed, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of anxiety. "I'm sure it's just a banking error," she replied calmly. The atmosphere in our home became increasingly tense as I continued to investigate the irregularities in our finances. Confronting Margaret, my mother-in-law, was a daunting task, but I knew it was a necessary step to uncover the truth. I couldn't let her theft go unchallenged, and I needed to protect our family's financial stability. After our initial conversation, where Margaret brushed off my concerns as a mere banking error, I couldn't let the matter rest. The mounting evidence suggested otherwise, and my gut feeling told me that something was deeply wrong. I decided to approach Margaret again, this time with more assertiveness. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon when she visited. David was away at work, leaving us alone in the house. I mustered my courage and led her into the living room for a private conversation. "Margaret," I began, my voice steady but firm. "I've been looking into our finances more closely and can't ignore the patterns I've discovered." She looked at me, her expression unreadable, but her unease was palpable. "What patterns?" she asked, feigning innocence. I couldn't hold back any longer. I presented the evidence, showing her the bank statements and the timeline of withdrawals that coincided with her visits. Margaret's face paled as she examined the documents. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at her, feeling a mix of betrayal and disappointment. "Margaret, I need to know if you had anything to do with this," I said, my voice trembling. She hesitated for a moment, her gaze shifting before finally admitting to her actions. "I was in financial trouble," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know what else to do. I thought I could pay it back without anyone noticing." Her words hung heavily in the air, a stark admission of guilt. Margaret's admission of guilt left me in shock. The room seemed to close in around me as the weight of her betrayal sank in. It was a difficult moment for both of us, but there was no turning back now. The truth had been revealed. As I processed her confession, Margaret began to explain her actions. She revealed that she had been facing significant financial problems and believed that she could take money from our savings without us noticing. She assured me that she intended to pay it back once her situation improved, but her desperation had driven her to this deceitful act. The room was filled with an awkward silence, broken only by the distant hum of traffic outside. I couldn't find the words to respond to her confession. The trust I had once held for her had been shattered, and I didn't know if it could ever be rebuilt. In the days that followed, I confronted Margaret about her theft, demanding that she return every cent she had taken. She agreed to do so, but I was no longer sure if I could trust her word. I decided to take matters into my own hands to ensure the safety of our finances. I discreetly installed security cameras around our home, focused on the areas where we kept important documents and our computer, which held our financial records. It was an extreme measure, but I felt that it was necessary to protect our family from any further deceit. As I reviewed the footage over the next few weeks, the web of deceit began to unravel even further. I discovered that Margaret had been accessing our financial records and bank account information without our knowledge. She'd been using her visits as opportunities to snoop around and make unauthorized transactions. With the unsettling truth about Margaret's theft and deceit continuing to unravel, tensions within our household reached a breaking point. The security cameras I had discreetly installed captured more evidence of her unauthorized access to our financial records, further confirming her betrayal. As I gathered this additional evidence, I couldn't help but feel a mounting sense of anger and betrayal. I had always tried to maintain a respectful and peaceful relationship with Margaret, and discovering her actions was a profound shock. One evening, David and I were sitting in our living room, poring over the latest footage from the security cameras. It revealed Margaret rifling through our documents, accessing our computer, and making unauthorized transactions. The evidence was undeniable, and it had become impossible to ignore. David's initial disbelief had gradually given way to anger and frustration. He turned to me, his face contorted with a mix of emotions. "How could she do this to us?" he exclaimed, his voice trembling with anger. Tears welled up in my eyes as I tried to convey the depth of my own feelings of betrayal. "I don't know, David," I replied, my voice cracking. "But we have to confront her about this. We can't let her get away with it." David agreed, and we decided to confront Margaret once more, armed with the evidence we had gathered. It was a tense and emotionally charged conversation that followed. Margaret initially denied any wrongdoing, attempting to deflect blame and minimize her actions. The argument escalated as we presented the concrete evidence, including video footage of her unauthorized activities. Margaret's denial slowly gave way to resignation, and she finally admitted to the extent of her deceit. The room filled with accusations, anger, and tears as the magnitude of the situation became painfully clear. In the midst of the heated argument, David's anger took a surprising turn. He turned his frustration toward me, accusing me of trying to come between him and his family. He refused to accept the full extent of his mother's actions, and my attempts to protect our family had inadvertently strained our relationship. The heated argument with David left our home filled with a thick, uncomfortable tension. It was a night I would never forget, as it seemed like our once loving relationship was crumbling under the weight of Margaret's betrayal. In the days that followed, David's anger and resentment towards me deepened. He couldn't reconcile his loyalty to his mother with the undeniable evidence of her deceit. Instead of uniting us in the face of adversity, the discovery had driven a wedge between us. One evening, as David and I sat in silence, the strain became unbearable. He turned to me, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and resignation. "I need some space," he finally said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I can't deal with all of this right now." I felt a lump in my throat as I realized what he meant. "You want me to leave?" I asked, my voice trembling. David nodded, and the tears welled up in my eyes. It was a painful, heartbreaking decision, but I knew I had to respect it. I began packing a few belongings, my hands shaking with a mixture of anger, sadness, and disbelief. As I left our home, I couldn't help but look back one last time at the life we had built together. The memories of our love and happiness seemed to mock me as I stepped out into the cold, dark night, homeless and alone. I moved in with a friend temporarily, trying to make sense of the whirlwind of emotions that engulfed me. I was heartbroken, betrayed not only by Margaret, but by David, the man I had thought would always stand by my side. As I settled into my friend's spare room, the reality of my situation began to sink in. I was homeless, my marriage was on the brink of collapse, and I was facing a future filled with uncertainty. It was a dark and difficult time, and I found myself grappling with a mix of emotions, including anger, sadness, and desperation. While David had asked me to leave, my love for him hadn't waned. I couldn't simply walk away from the life we had built together without trying to salvage our relationship, so I decided to take action. I needed to prove to him that Margaret's betrayal was real and that our love was worth fighting for. I continued to gather evidence against Margaret, making sure to document every financial transaction and piece of information that could expose her deceit. I also began exploring legal options to hold her accountable for her actions. Filing a police report was a difficult step, as it meant officially involving the authorities in our family's turmoil. But I knew it was necessary to ensure that justice was served and to protect our financial stability. The legal process was slow and daunting, but I was determined to see it through. During this time, I also began attending therapy to help me cope with the emotional toll of the situation. It was a crucial step in maintaining my mental and emotional well-being, and it provided me with the support and guidance I needed to navigate the complex web of emotions I was experiencing. Despite the turmoil and the uncertainty, I clung to the hope that our love could withstand this ordeal. I knew that David was facing his own internal struggles, torn between his loyalty to his mother and his love for me. It was a delicate balancing act, and I could only hope that, with time and understanding, he would come to realize the truth. Months passed, and my life felt like a never-ending roller coaster of emotions, legal battles, and personal growth. The police investigation into Margaret's actions had progressed, and the evidence I had gathered had played a pivotal role in building a strong case against her. While I was making strides in the legal realm, my personal life remained in turmoil. David and I had little contact during this period, and every conversation was strained. The love that had once bound us now felt distant, replaced by a chasm of hurt and mistrust. Then, one fateful day, David showed up at my friend's doorstep unannounced. His eyes were red and puffy, and it was clear he had been crying. The moment I saw him, my heart skipped a beat. I had missed him so much, and despite everything that had happened, I still loved him deeply. David's voice quivered as he apologized for his anger and for asking me to leave. He explained that he had finally realized the full extent of his mother's betrayal and how she had manipulated him into doubting me. The weight of the truth had hit him hard, and he was devastated by the damage it had caused to our marriage. Tears streamed down both our faces as David asked for forgiveness, his vulnerability and sincerity shining through. He admitted that he had been wrong and that he desperately wanted to rebuild our life together. I could see the pain in his eyes, and I knew that he was as broken as I had been. I embraced David, and in that moment, it felt like the weight of the world had been lifted from our shoulders. The journey had been long and painful, but it had brought us to this point of forgiveness and reconciliation. Together, we decided to face the challenges ahead as a united front. Margaret was facing the legal consequences of her actions, and we were determined to move forward, stronger and more committed to each other than ever before. Our love had proven resilient, and we were ready to rebuild our life together, knowing that we could weather any storm as long as we faced it together.